Welcome, everybody, and thank you all for coming tonight. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's here to our 2020 Gold Watch Award ceremony and virtual party. This year has been tremendously busy with our update on Minnesota's response to trafficking, countering the backlash against human rights, and of course, our court observation project, Watch. Pro bono teams from Faegre Drinker Biddle contributed more than 2,000 hours to monitor Minnesota's response to sex trafficking. They asked more than 100 stakeholders what is needed to strengthen the system, services, and solutions in our state. And we're looking forward to sharing the resulting recommendations with you next year. We continue to partner with human rights defenders in 20 countries on addressing the backlash against human rights, mostly by exchanging information and meeting virtually. With the support of Frederickson and Byron, we have created a secure extranet, which includes an online library with 800 resources that we've uploaded, so that our partners can access this information safely wherever they are in the world. And this collaboration is needed now more than ever. For example, Poland recently announced its decision to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, the most comprehensive treaty on violence against women. Now, Poland's decision sets a dangerous precedent for other countries that experience internal opposition to LGBTI and women's rights. But with the help of Aiken Gump, we are investigating the backlash to the Istanbul Convention. Our work will expose how the opposition twists the treaty and spreads myths about it. For example, myths like violence against women doesn't exist in their country because domestic violence is something that immigrants bring in from their own cultures. So it's myths that we will hope to dispel with our work when we launch a report next year. Finally, we have begun to redeploy our watch volunteers into the courtrooms. We are excited to resume our monitoring of cases of violence against women and children, both in person and virtually, bringing the public into the courts. COVID-19 turned everything upside down, but at the Advocates, with the help of our volunteers, we remain poised and agile to respond to the most emergent needs. So I will now turn the mic over to Susan Lenfestey, co-founder of Watch and recipient of our 2019 Gold Watch Award, to share more. Susan, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Rose. Hi, everyone, wherever you may be in this surreal time. I hope you're doing well. I have such wonderful memories of our gathering last year at the Kaplans, and I hope that we can all be together again soon. It was an honor to receive the Gold Watch Award then, and an honor to congratulate this year's recipients tonight. Since we gathered last year, we've faced unimaginable tragedy and loss. From COVID to George Floyd, to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, our lives, our values, and our democracy have been rocked. I Can't Breathe went from a plea to a protest to a heartrending refrain. I can't breathe when a virus is in my lungs. I can't breathe when a knee is on my neck. I can't breathe when an abuser's hand is around my throat. You may not know that in 2005, after gathering data and facts, Watch was able to get legislation passed in Minnesota, making strangulation during a domestic assault a felony. Prior to the law's passage, most domestic strangulation cases were charged as misdemeanor assaults, with few, if any, consequences. Watch and the Advocates continue to help victims breathe. I'm so gratified that the COVID-19 volunteer team stepped up in the midst of the pandemic to make sure that despite the statewide shutdown, victims of domestic violence still had access to legal protections. Your passion and persistence gives us hope. I can't close without mentioning the heartbreaking loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a mentor and inspiration to so many of us. As she famously said during her first oral arguments before the Supreme Court in 1973, or more accurately, quoting the words of Sarah Moore Grimke, a 19th century abolitionist and women's rights activist, I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks. In her honor, we will persist in the courts, at the polls, in our daily lives until everyone can breathe freely. Thank you.
Susan, thank you for your beautiful remarks, and most importantly, for starting this crucial court observation work 28 years ago. And now it's an honor for me to present the Gold Watch Award. With the emergence of COVID-19, stay-at-home orders, curfews, and other regulations, violence against women escalated around the world. Calls to hotlines surged, victims' access to information diminished, safe places to report or escape abuse decreased, and resources for violence against women were redirected to meeting COVID-19 needs. While we were forced to suspend our in-person watch court observation temporarily, we knew it was crucial to monitor the state's response to domestic and sexual violence. A dedicated team of volunteers, Linda Foreman, Peggy Grieve, Rachel Hamlin, Linda Svitak, and Julie Shelton, stepped up to help us fact-find throughout the pandemic. Our team conducted interviews as quickly as possible so we could share our knowledge in real time with local partners. We turned around our analyses to Violence Free Minnesota, Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and Standpoint to help inform their advocacy and training. To date, the volunteer team has conducted more than 40 interviews with stakeholders in 6 Minnesota counties. And when we're done, we'll produce a final look-back report with recommendations. Thanks to our dedicated volunteers, we could carry out this important work. We are pleased to honor our COVID-19 research team with the 2020 Gold Watch Award for their time and commitment to ensuring Minnesota is a safer place for women and children under the pandemic. It is an honor for me to introduce each volunteer and invite them to share their experiences. Linda Foreman is our first Gold Watch Award recipient. Linda has volunteered with the Advocates for 25 years. She has participated in fact-finding missions, conducted research, and compiled reports on domestic violence and treaty obligations of Central and Eastern European countries. She was the executive director of Children's Law Center and a partner at Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi. So Linda, I want to ask you, because you have been such a longtime volunteer with the Advocates. Can you share with us why you volunteer with us?
Thank you, Rose. The Advocates for Human Rights is a small organization with a huge international, national, and statewide reputation for excellence. Over the years, I found the Advocates to be an organization that truly welcomes volunteers. It offers opportunities to get involved with highly sophisticated and complex projects that have a profound impact on people and institutions around the world. That's why I volunteer with the Advocates.
Thank you, Linda, and congratulations. Peggy Grieve, and I should ask all the volunteers to give a little wave. I know we have a lot of tiles here. Peggy Grieve is our second Gold Watch Award recipient. After a successful career as an investment bank financial services lawyer, Peggy earned a Master of Public Affairs with a minor in Human Rights from the Humphrey School of Public Policy. She is a dedicated volunteer who served as co-investigator into the implementation of Colombia's laws on intimate partner violence against women and serves on the Advocates Board of Directors. Now, Peggy, you have hit the ground sprinting since you became involved with the Advocates a few years ago. Can you tell us why you volunteer with the Advocates? Peggy, you're muted.
Well, Rose, you've given me a softball question because after you've heard from Linda, who's a volunteer for 25 years, you must think that the Advocates has a secret sauce for volunteers. And I can absolutely guarantee that is the fact. They value their volunteers. They train them and they empower them to work in really unique ways to change the outcomes for individuals and the society in which we live here in Minnesota, nationally and internationally. And I've served on boards that have been local, national, and international. And nobody does it better for volunteers than the Advocates for Human Rights. It doesn't matter what your skill set is. there is a meaningful way to contribute where you will feel that your talents are used and that you're actually making a difference. So that's why I volunteer for the Advocates.
Thank you, Peggy. And Peggy, you have been involved in so many diverse and varied volunteer projects with us. I'm wondering what prompted you to take on this project?
Well, COVID-19 is hard. I don't care who you are, where you live, what you do, or how many resources. It is hard for us all. And as I was sitting in my Minnesota home, which is safe and comfortable, and I can go out and walk around in a lot of land, every time I thought I might feel sorry for myself, I only had to think of the rest of the world who had it so many more challenges. And when I thought, what can I do? Since of course I'm limited in the sense that being high risk, I couldn't be out there in the front lines, I'm not a nurse, that being able to help look at the justice system and what was happening in COVID-19 in connection with sexual assault and domestic violence was a uniquely important way to be able to contribute. Women who are subject to domestic violence or sexual assault depend on access to the justice system to protect them and their children. And COVID-19, through the entire judicial system, the justice system, the service system that assists women into chaos as they all struggled to adapt. So being able to help interview the people on the front lines, identify the challenges, and potentially help identify some measures that would ameliorate this process at this terrible time was really a great honor.
Thank you, Peggy, and congratulations. Rachel Hamlin, if you want to give a little wave. Rachel Hamlin is our next Gold Watch Award recipient. Rachel's experience as a corporate law attorney has served her well over her 25 plus years as a volunteer with the Advocates. Among various projects, Rachel joined the Advocates team at a conference in Bulgaria and co-authored a report with Executive Director Robin Phillips on sex discrimination and sexual harassment in the workplace in Bulgaria. Rachel, if you could unmute your phone or your mic, I'd like to ask you, after your intense focus on Bulgaria in the past, what made you decide to volunteer on this COVID-19 research?
Thank you, Rose. When COVID-19 hit the United States in late February and early March, like you, I woke up every day to the news filled with stories of people getting sick, dying, losing their jobs. There were so many unknowns: how the virus spread, how to treat it, how do we keep ourselves safe and our families safe, what is going to happen to our jobs, to the economy. It was a very frightening time. And life as we knew it had changed dramatically. But during that time, initially, I realized I was one of the lucky ones. My home, my family, my finances were safe and secure. I wasn't an essential worker. I didn't have to put my life on the line. But for so many others, however, the pandemic threatened not only their health, but their financial stability and, sadly, their safety in their own homes. Shelter-in-place requirements left people stuck in their homes with their abusers, with little support or recourse. So I was very happy to work on this project to shed light on the crisis many people were facing in their homes related to domestic violence, which was being exacerbated by COVID-19.
So, Rachel, thank you for sharing that. And I'm just curious, when you started this research, what did you expect to find and what did you actually find out?
Circumstances created by COVID-19, such as fear, of contracting the virus, financial uncertainty, isolating at home, children home with you 24/7 have added stress to the family unit. And I expected to hear that these added stressors due to the pandemic were creating an environment in people's homes that increased the likelihood of incidents of domestic violence. And I think I found that to be true. I also expected to hear that the pandemic was creating barriers for victims seeking help or trying to make change to their abusive circumstances. I found this also to be true. When the courts, lawyers, advocates, and other support services closed or went online only, victims then had to face and overcome barriers such as lack of privacy in their home or lack of access to technology in order to report incidents of domestic violence. I also expected to hear that fears of contracting the virus would result in less reporting of incidents of domestic violence to the police and less willingness on the part of victims to use shelters. And that also proved to be true, especially in the first weeks and months of the pandemic. But what I also learned during the interview process was the resilience and savvy of so many victims of domestic violence who still were able to seek help from advocates and lawyers to prepare filings. They learned and figured out how to use the online tools provided by the courts to file orders for protection. And I saw the amazing dedication of the system's actors, the advocates, the lawyers, the courts, to be innovative and creative in order to provide support to victims of domestic violence during this unprecedented and challenging time of COVID-19.
Thank you, Rachel, and congratulations.
Thank you. I'm honored to get the award.
Linda Svitak, you want to give a little wave, Linda? Linda Svitak is our next Gold Watch Award recipient. Linda is a trial lawyer with more than 30 years of experience and was a registered nurse. She has a long-term commitment to pro bono service, particularly in the areas of homelessness, women and children's rights, and international human rights. Now, Linda, if you could unmute your mic, I have a couple questions for you. My first one, Linda, is that victim support is a key part of ensuring they can stay safe and have their needs met. Based on our findings so far, how has COVID-19 affected services for victims?
Thank you, Rose. Addressing the needs of victims of sexual violence has always been challenging, but COVID has added a new dimension altogether, and that's that many services are remote. In-person contacts have given way to telephone calls, to Zoom meetings, to online services, but remote services are not necessarily the most effective way to provide empathy and support to victims. There's no eye contact, there's no comforting look. It's very difficult to establish rapport with victims remotely. And that assumes that the technology works. Providers are still figuring out ways to make technology work in this new world, but the truth is it doesn't always work. Calls get dropped, batteries die, computers freeze. These frustrations impact the ability of victims to obtain needed services. And perhaps the greatest limitation for current technology is this: not everyone has it. Many people do not have computers. They don't have tablets, iPhones. They lack the very tools that they need to forge the connections that they're seeking. Connections with advocates, with investigators, with courts, with other resources. Many challenges in the context of providing services.
And Linda, building on this, you were a nurse at one point.
I was.
We would love to hear more about those who are investigating sexual assault. And I'm wondering if you can describe to us, how has COVID-19 impacted the work of sexual assault nurse examiners who do the medical forensic care of patients?
Well, COVID-19 is very real, and victims and responders alike are very concerned about exposure. So like some of the other services, when it's possible, some investigations are conducted remotely. And I just mentioned some of the challenges that go along with remote work. But by necessity, it's not always possible to conduct investigations remotely. So when they need to be performed in person, responders, like nurse examiners, generally follow health protocols. That includes wearing masks, various PPE, and they do so to decrease the risk to both victims and the responder. But again, while PPE is critical for safety purposes, it also can increase the distance between a victim and a responder at a very vulnerable time. Now, hospital interventions are also present some unique challenges. Victims are often reluctant to go to a hospital for fear of COVID exposure, but they may need to go for medical attention or for a forensic interview or an examination by a SANES, a sexual assault nurse examiner, to collect evidence. Now, these are very personal examinations where outside support from a family member or a friend is helpful. But under our current COVID restrictions, outside visitors are not allowed in the hospital. Likewise, advocates are not allowed, although some hospitals will allow them to attend by phone. The result is that a victim is alone with a sane nurse who is dressed with a gown, perhaps a mask, perhaps a shield. And despite support from that nurse, this can be a lonely and frightening experience for a victim. The SANES have reported that the number of examinations have dropped following the pandemic and hospital restrictions. Investigations of sexual violence are always challenging, but COVID has significantly impacted the nature of many of the investigations and has also made it more difficult to be victim-centric, which is ultimately our goal, in part because of PPE and social distancing being the norm.
Thank you, Linda, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Our final Gold Watch Award recipient is Julie Shelton. Julie, if you want to give a little wave. After 30 years as a trial lawyer, Julie devotes her time to volunteering for human rights. She served on the board of directors of the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center and is a longtime volunteer with the Advocates. Julie, if you can unmute your mic, I'd like to hear from you. What surprised you the most from this project?
Thank you, Rose. What surprised me the most was the extent of the competing interests presented by COVID and the complexity of addressing and resolving the problems system-wide. One advocate told us, "We have to make a lot of impossible decisions with no good answers." One obvious example is the understandable desire to minimize the spread of virus in jails and prisons, not only to protect the detained individuals, but also jail staff and their families. So jail populations have been reduced and judges have been reluctant to send new offenders to jail. As one advocate told us, quote, "COVID has become a get out of jail free card." But that presents safety concerns for the victims. Offenders are being released without first appearance hearings, and that leads to no conditions being set on their releases. One prosecutor told us it has turned into no bail, no jail, and no probation violations. Another prosecutor said, "I see the defendant's rights far outweighing the victim's safety and the victim's rights." And another said, quote, "It's a good time to be a criminal." Courts across the state have been unable to conduct hearings, and there are huge backlogs of cases set for trial. We know that delays in prosecuting domestic violence cases mean that some of these cases will fall apart. Witnesses and victims lose confidence in the system, and offenders have impunity. Yet, how can courts impanel juries safely and protect witnesses and staff? Another example relates to technology and working remotely. It's been good and bad. You've heard about some of the problems, so I'll just highlight a couple of positive aspects. Many advocates and others have adapted quickly, using their smartphones, laptops, and a variety of apps. Courts that are comfortable with technology have allowed electronic filings and begun to hold some remote hearings. In some cases, this has actually benefited victims. For example, one advocate told us that clients with childcare needs can now attend remote hearings more easily, as well as, quote, "without having to show their face so the abuser doesn't know that they're there." Hopefully, going forward, we can keep these positive aspects as well as meet the challenges we heard about earlier.
And Julie, as we start to write the report, now that we have all these rich and substantive findings, I'm wondering, can you share with us what personal insights you've gained from this project?
Well, just how much has changed and how continual change requires continual adjustment and innovation by the system's actors. The fluidity of the situation has made it very difficult to come up with a plan of action that works for everyone. In the different counties, large and small. As the director of an advocacy agency said, quote, "So policies are nice, they're lovely, but outdated as soon as everybody agrees on them." This underscores the need for a multidisciplinary approach in which all the systems actors build relationships with each other and continually share experiences and perspectives about what works and what doesn't, where they have the time and space to think creatively and to develop policies and practices that address competing interests and meet as many needs as possible.
Thank you, Julie, and congratulations.
Thank you, Rose.
Let's take a final look at how we address these challenges that we have learned about. Going back to Linda Foreman, Linda, can you tell us some of the solutions our fact-finding identified to help overcome challenges for cases of sexual and domestic violence during the pandemic?
Well, I think we've heard a lot about the problems that the systems actors encountered as the pandemic got rolling. But I have to say that I was really impressed with the resilience of many of the actors in this system. I could go on for hours about the innovations and creativity that we encountered with people that we were speaking with who are working in the system to deal with these obstacles that were created primarily by the stay-at-home orders and quarantines. But let me highlight just a few, because like I said, I could go on for hours. Across the board, we found domestic violence advocates who creatively used technology to better connect with and serve their clients. This included the use of telephones, even though that's not optimal, but for a greater number of check-ins and contact points with their clients. A greater collaboration with their peers across the state and across the nation via Zoom to discuss best practices and ideas on handling certain situations. Using different technology applications like Google Voice texting to communicate with their clients who were afraid to actually answer the phone. Giving clients cell phones so that they could communicate with their clients, and doing Facebook Live presentations for outreach. But it also included a lot of non-techie solutions, like putting domestic violence service organization telephone numbers into laundromats or other places where victims might be free from their abuser and be able to call for help. It also involved domestic violence advocates assisting clients with day-to-day living necessities and helping them with remote educational tech advice for their children who were taking their classes via the internet. Nurses and therapists also embraced technology to provide needed services to victims. We found therapists who quickly moved to Zoom or telehealth to continue to provide counseling and therapy sessions for victims. Likewise, SANE nurses, as Linda Svitak said, SANE nurses in one hospital started using smartphones and iPads to allow FaceTime contact between a victim and an advocate during the SANE exam, so that the victim was not in the room by herself. There was somebody on FaceTime with her. And while we don't usually think of the police as being innovative, we were proved wrong. One police department started doing social media posts early in the pandemic to let people know that domestic violence resources were still available and that they could call for help. Another department gave its officers smartphones to allow officers to FaceTime victim advocates while they were interviewing a victim. And one investigator found a way to interview domestic violence victims in person, as she had done in the past, by meeting them at a picnic table behind the station, where they could socially distance for the interview, fully masked, and she could record the interview on her body cam. Even the courts and counties were able to adapt to some degree. One court negotiated a fee waiver of the cost to use GPS and electronic home monitoring devices so that when abusers were freed from jail due to virus concerns within the jail, they could be tracked. A judge in another county provided victim advocates with her direct dial number so that they could contact her with concerns about cases. And another county opened a conference room in the government center where victims could go to safely call an advocate with a deputy present and instructions on what to do in multiple languages. But I really think the greatest innovation that we found was that across the board, different actors in the system started to come out of their silos, connecting and collaborating with others, and recognizing the need for everyone to be more flexible in how they do their work and how they approach issues. So I was impressed with what we found.
Thank you so much, Linda. And everyone on the team, it is an honor to present you with the 2020 Gold Watch Award for your important work on uncovering these challenges under COVID-19. You make this work possible. I'd like to introduce Nikki Engel, who will be talking about the volunteers' work and their impact, the impact of the volunteers' work on the systems. Nikki Engel is the Policy and Legal Systems Program Manager at Violence Free Minnesota, the Coalition to End Relationship Abuse. She works with domestic violence agencies and advocates across the state on a legal system response to victims. She also works with statewide systems and policymakers to ensure that victims and advocates' voices are represented in policy-making decisions. Before joining the coalition, Nikki worked as a legal advocate with LGBTQ+ victims of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and hate and bias violence in Minnesota. Nikki, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Rose, and the Advocates for Human Rights for inviting me to speak this evening. And most of all, thank you for the incredible research that the COVID-19 research team at the Advocates completed. It's great to meet you virtually, and thank you personally, Linda, Peggy, Rachel, Linda, and Julie. As Rose said, my name is Nikki Engel, and I work as Policy and Legal Systems Program Manager at Violence Free Minnesota. As some of you on the call know, Violence Free Minnesota is our state's coalition of domestic violence programs. We were founded in 1978 and currently represent over 90 community-based domestic violence programs. Our mission is fourfold: to represent victims and survivors of relationship abuse, to challenge systems and institutions, to promote social change, and to support the work of our domestic violence member programs. We have been just a few short weeks into Minnesota's pandemic-initiated court restrictions and stay-at-home orders when we received deeply concerning information from domestic violence advocates. Some DV agencies were reporting a significant increase in their hotline calls, while others were reporting a similarly stark decrease. Both of these were alarming for different reasons, right? Then we learned about a slew of new barriers and difficulties as a result of courthouse restrictions. As the state's collective voice for the needs of domestic violence victims, we were alarmed. We sit at many different tables with leaders of state and governmental agencies. We needed facts, we needed a comprehensive picture of the impact of the pandemic on victim survivors, and we needed it quickly. We rely on this information for shaping our conversations with systems partners and requests for improvements and reforms. At the same time, unlike the Advocates for Human Rights and their amazing volunteers, we do not always have easy access to some of the same systems actors that you all do. The ability of the COVID-19 research team at the Advocates for Human Rights to quickly organize, conduct, and summarize interview data with advocates and systems actors was instrumental in giving the coalition a robust picture of victim needs and criminal legal system response during the early stages of COVID-19. In the urgency and fear of the initial crisis, it wasn't immediately clear to us what would be the most impactful and effective asks we could make to our Minnesota law enforcement, courts, government, and funders to improve the situation for victims and their children at this time. The information collected and summarized by the COVID-19 research team assisted us in identifying and shaping those asks. For example, one theme that became increasingly clear as the memos progressed was COVID-19's impact on victims' ability to meet their basic needs. Unemployment, housing instability, food insecurity, loss of childcare, all of these things had intensified as a result of the pandemic, and advocates were spending more time attempting to address these needs with victims. This information was critical in supporting our ask to the Minnesota Disaster Relief Fund for direct cash assistance for victims, and we received $240,000 to do so. This money was passed on directly to victims and made an incredible impact on the lives of many Minnesota victims and their children. Moreover, the research also provided important insight into the experiences of systems actors at every point of contact for victims, from that initial law enforcement response to criminal prosecution of a case, to civil protections and relief, to probation and parole. Having that kind of insight is critical for us at the Coalition to craft the best recommendations and approach to each of these different entities. We were getting accurate and actionable information in COVID-19 at every step of a victim survivor's journey through the system. That is powerful. For example, we learned about many of the ways that individuals that use violence and abuse were leveraging COVID-19 to manipulate victims and law enforcement on scene. Community-based domestic violence advocates, our member base, are not at these scenes. And so this was critical new information for us that we couldn't have gotten any other way. As the pandemic progressed, we at Violence Free Minnesota utilized the data collected and analyzed by the COVID-19 team in many ways and with various audiences. At one point, I gave a presentation to close to 100 law enforcement leaders across the state. We had never been invited to this table before. The information and examples that I was privy to as a result of this research proved extremely beneficial in shaping that conversation. For example, I was able to provide concrete examples from law enforcement officers themselves about the new challenges COVID-19 had introduced when they responded to domestic abuse calls. And that information allowed us to have a different kind and level of conversation that we would have been able to have otherwise. We've shared information from this research with our member programs through weekly and monthly COVID-19 specific calls that has been of great use to them in working with their own local courts. And I'm confident that we will continue to benefit from this research as we at the Coalition have the time and space to reflect on the experiences of the last 7 months, the lessons we have all learned, and how we can continue to improve the response to domestic violence and sexual assault in Minnesota, both in times of unprecedented crisis like the pandemic and every day. We're so appreciative of the COVID-19 research team and all of their hard work in what has been an incredibly difficult time. So thank you so much from all of us at the Coalition.
Thank you, Nikki. It's been an absolute privilege to partner with you and Violence Free Minnesota on this important work. Now, before we go into our breakout rooms for socializing, I want to thank all of you for your support to make the world safer for women and girls. You help our partners who try so valiantly to protect women's rights against those who dismiss the Istanbul Convention. You help investigate how Minnesota is doing in its response to sex trafficking. And you help deploy volunteers into the courtrooms as the public eye on our legal system. I want to end with a story about our Belarus partner, Tatiana. As you all know, there have been widespread human rights violations in Belarus since the elections, crackdowns on protesters, arrests, detentions, and torture. Tatiana shared with us that hundreds of women are detained every week. Up to 40 are crammed into a cell meant for 5. There are reports of rapes. They are denied food and feminine hygiene products, even access to toilets. Some women are sharing a single bottle to drink tap water out of, and many of them have contracted COVID-19 in detention and are now ill. Tatiana wrote to me asking for help to bring a complaint to CEDAW, the UN body on discrimination against women, because she did not know how to craft the argument. Well, I encouraged her to apply to the Women's Human Rights Training Institute that our Bulgarian partner and the advocates organized together. This training academy teaches lawyers how to protect women's rights when all other options at home have failed them. The good news? She's been accepted. So for the next 2 years, she will be learning how to bring cases of women's human rights violations, like those of Belarus's detained women, before the highest human rights bodies in the world. We can do more. We can train more human rights defenders. We can monitor more court cases and implementation of laws. Doing more takes all of us. It takes volunteers, it takes staff, and it takes financial resources. Tonight, I am asking for your financial support. Can you help raise $60,000? We are already halfway there because every dollar that you give will be doubled. Generous individuals have promised to match your donation, and we also have a challenge grant from the Otto Bremer Trust. Simply text advocates to 243725. Please give generously and make Minnesota and the world a safer and equal place for women and girls.